I hated this book more than I did Lolita, so let's exercise this demon for me together, yeah? I've debated the format of this video. I thought about maybe making it a modern take thing, but then it would have just been me screaming, "It's not okay!" So that probably wouldn't have been productive, so let's try it the standard way. Let's quickly recap Bunin's story, as it's going to be relevant for the themes that I'm going to be talking about later, and then actually get into the meat of the narrative. Ivan Bunin believed himself to be the last Russian classic. He was born 1870, so he actually got to meet quite a few of the 19th century authors, notably Tolstoy and Chekhov, Kuprin, and also lesser known such as Brusov or Andreev. But since he also lived quite a long life, he also saw the first wave of the Soviet authors such as Gorky or Mayakovsky, the latter of whom he hated passionately. Bunin came from old nobility, but by the time that he was born, the family had already wasted all their money away, so he didn't receive the same education or station as the noble authors before him, like Tolstoy or Turgenev. But Bunin still took a lot of pride in his heritage, sometimes maybe to a fault. He started his literary journey quite early on. His first publication happened at 16 years old, but the first true success happened in 1903 with a collection of poems called Fallen Leaves, for which he received the coveted Pushkin Prize. The first period of his writing was dedicated to poetry, but he soon started dabbling in prose, mostly short stories. But Bunin's life fell on quite a period of change for Russia. First World War I, but also the Russian Revolution. And Bunin was one of the most vocal opponents of the Bolshevik Revolution. Authors like Alexander Blok, Mayakovsky, Gorky even, they saw potential in these changing tides of the political landscape of their country, while Bunin only saw destruction. Destruction of the old way of life of the country that he loved so dearly. In 1920, he took the ship to Constantinople, then later installed himself in France, and never returned to the Soviet Union. His life in emigration was prolific in terms of writing. Arguably his most famous piece, the novel The Life of Arseniev, was written in emigration, a semi-autobiographical piece about his childhood and adolescence in the Russian Empire. And just similarly, The Cursed Days, the depiction of Bunin's days just after the October Revolution, full of his hatred and revulsion towards the revolution itself and the rule of Soviets in general. All this made Bunin quite a prominent figure in the Russian emigration in Europe and helped him achieve an honor that no Russian author had before him. In 1933, Bunin received the Nobel Prize for Literature for following through and developing with chastity and artfulness the traditions of Russian classical prose. Bunin actually donated a tenth of his award money to a fund to help support his fellow Russian émigré authors. The rest he spent over the next few years, so by the time the World War II rolled around, there was literally no money left. Bunin in general was not that good with money. The award itself was politically motivated in part. It was supposed to be an FU towards the Soviet Union, and Bunin was selected as the best candidate out of all the Russian émigrés. But what is true is that wording. Bunin believed himself to be the carrier, the vessel of that lost Russian traditional classical literature. Even before his emigration, he was spatting with the modernists of that time, like the aforementioned Mayakovsky, for example. Bunin in general had a rather narrow view of art, and so any deviation or innovation in it he rejected quite loudly. And that actually led to an interesting phenomenon. If you read Bunin without knowing the details of his life, you fully expect him to be the 19th century author like Tolstoy, Chekhov, or Dostoevsky. Except most of Bunin's works were written in the first half of the 20th century. He retained this traditional style of writing that was almost gone by the 1920s. The authors that stayed in the Soviet Union, they were doing their own thing, but even the authors of Russian immigration, they couldn't really emulate this traditional style like Bunin did, and really few tried. Bunin's series of short stories, Dark Avenues, written 1937-45, are a swan song to that type of traditional literature, but also to the imperial Russia that's been gone for 20 years at that point. Bunin passed away in 1953, and he's buried in Saint-Geneviève-de-Bois cemetery near Paris. A fun fact to cheer you up here is that Bunin was born the same year as Lenin and died the same year as Stalin. A few words about Bunin's love life, as it's going to be important. His first love happened in his early 20s. He fell in love with a woman called Varvara, but they were never married, as her family didn't approve of the poor and unsettled Bunin. They lived together for a little bit, just simply not married, until one night she left him in the middle of the night and left him a note, Vanya, goodbye and please forgive me. Turns out that she left him for a good friend of Bunin's, actor Arseny Bibikov. Whoops. 1898, Bunin married his first wife, a 19-year-old Anna. A summer fling that probably went a little bit too far. Rumors spread that he was only marrying her for money, a rumor that upset Bunin so much that he actually ran away from his own wedding reception. The couple only lived together a couple of months, but the marriage lasted 20 years on paper. Anna wouldn't grant him a divorce. Their son Nikolai died as a child, and Bunin never had any other children after that. 1906, Bunin met his second wife, Vera Muromtseva, with whom he stayed until the very end of his life. The couple went through quite a few hardships together. They went into immigration together, but they only got married in 1922. But that's not the end of the story. 1926, a 56-year-old Bunin met a 26-year-old aspiring writer, Galina Kuznetsova. The cover story was that he was supposed to be her mentor, but who were they trying to fool? The society and Vera soon found out about the affair. And Bunin made a controversial decision and actually moved his lover into the house with them. So for quite a few years, they all lived together, Bunin, his wife, and his mistress. He even took Galina along with him and Vera to Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize. That actually was an unfortunate decision for him, as on the trip Galina met an opera singer, Margarita Stipun, and soon she left Bunin for her. But for a little bit, Margarita also lived with the Bunins and Galina. There was also something going on between Vera and a writer, Leonid Zurov, who was also living with the Bunins, so it got crazy there for a little bit in that love pentagon. These women of Bunin's life appear in his writing. For instance, his first love, Varvara, is the prototype for the love interest Lika in the life of Arseniev, and the breakup with Galina served as inspiration for the Dark Avenues. So let's talk about the book. I've read it twice now. That's normally how my prep for this video goes. So my first reaction to it was this guttural hate for it, because the lows of these stories are so low that they overshadow everything else. On my second read, I was able to have a little bit more of a level approach to it, to see the better parts of it, but still my overall impression of the book is that it's an awful book and I hate it quite a bit. There are non-debatable issues in plots and themes in some of these stories that are not present in others, but there are also motifs and moods that persist over all of the stories that we need to talk about. As I've mentioned, the stories were written over the course of 10 years, from 1937 through 1945, mostly in Grasse, south of France, in occupied France during World War II. Bunin's wife Vera said that the Dark Avenues appeared partly because we wanted to escape the war into another world where the blood does not flow, where people do not burn alive, and so on. We were busy writing, and it helped us to endure the unbearable. Genre definition for the stories also varies. Most of them are short stories, but there are also novellas, anecdotes, scenes, and even poems in prose. Vera also said that Bunin believed these stories to be the most perfect and masterful of his. Since it's a collection of short stories, it's simply impossible for me to recap the plot of every single one for you. There are 38 in here, it's simply not sensible. So how about I pick a few to give you a feel of what these stories are, and I will try to use the same stories to talk about themes later on in the video. Also, trigger warnings do apply, so proceed with caution. The first story, the story Dark Avenues, is a short scene of a man stopping by some private quarters to rest for a bit on his journey. He meets the owner, a woman called Nadezhda, who turns out to be his former lover, whom he left many years ago. Nadezhda never married. Seemingly he was the love of her life, while he got to move on and marry, even if his family life didn't turn out that great. As he flees the room, he gets to ponder for a moment what life could have been had he not chosen to abandon her. In Natalie, a young student comes to stay at his uncle's for summer. There he is greeted by his cousin Sonia, with whom they seemingly have had an affair already. She mentions that her friend Natalie is staying with them and warns him against falling in love with her, as she sees it as inevitable. He is instantly taken by Natalie, so he spends quite a bit of time torn between Sonia and Natalie. That is until one night Natalie catches him with Sonia in a compromising position. The student leaves and later finds out that Natalie married his distant relative. He even gets to see them at a ball, and that tears him up inside. He moves on somewhat by taking a peasant girl who even gives birth to his child. He then finds out that Natalie's husband died, and he decides to go visit her. His lover warns him first that if he ever were to marry somebody else, she'd kill herself and the child. When they reunite, he and Natalie understand that they still have feelings for each other, but they cannot marry because of that threat, so Natalie agrees to live with him out of wedlock. Natalie soon dies in premature labor. In Muse, the artist is approached by a woman who wants him to be her lover. They have a long affair. She comes to see him every other day when he lives in the countryside. That is until she leaves him for his neighbor. In Styopa, a man called Krasivchikov travels south and decides to stop at an inn for a night. The owner is not there, but his 15-year-old daughter is, and she decides to let him in because she knows him already. Despite her protests, he takes her to bed. In the morning, he promises to come back and marry her, never to return. In a cold autumn, an engagement party is broken up by the news of World War I breaking out. The fiancé goes to serve his country and gets killed a month later. His fiancée goes through the hardships of living that life. After the revolution, she's forced to work in Moscow. That is until she meets a man who agrees to marry her and take her away, until he dies on the ship going to Constantinople. So the woman is once again alone, except for her husband's brother, his wife, and their daughter. When they arrive in Europe, they leave the child with her and disappear. She works to support herself and the girl, and now, years later, she still remembers her fiancé's last words to her. "If I were to die, I will wait up there for you. You live, you enjoy life, and then come join me." And now she's finally ready to join him. There are themes that persist over these stories. Thanks to a quote from Bunin, critics and readers alike call these stories love stories. This book is called after the first story, Dark Avenues. In all the following ones, it is, so to speak, also about the dark and most often very cruel avenues of love. And I think that's where my first negative knee-jerk reaction came from, because as I read them, very few of these stories can actually be considered love stories. Most are lust stories at best, and then there are abuse stories, and that's where the ick factor really comes in, as it is rather problematic to label them as love stories. On my second read, I marked the stories that have elements of non-con, dop-con, or manipulation in order to get sex, and it's not a small number of stories. At least 11 by my count, and it's a third of the stories. And to be perfectly honest with you, I would call maybe 2 stories, like love stories, rather than lust or passion. So at the very least, I feel like romantic love is rather underrepresented in this series. There is also a popular reading that Bunin speaks of the irrational nature of love, and that's why he talks about passion, as it is passion that comes out of nowhere and consumes you whole. And maybe it was Bunin's intention to focus on the carnal desires, the physical nature of love, but the way he writes about it is also not ideal. The unflattering reading of it is that it is a man in his late years, and Bunin was in his 60s and 70s when he wrote these stories, writing about the pursuits of young love that are no longer available to him. The focus on the sexual aspect of love shocked Bunin's contemporaries, especially the Russian emigres. The Western press was a little bit warmer on it. I've said this in my Lolita video. I do not mind erotica. I've read full pornographic stories. I may be asexual, but I'm not a prude. And really, what we get in Dark Avenues is really mild by today's standards. And yet, after some of these stories, I really wanted to take a shower to wash them off of me. An author can approach erotica from different angles. It can be fun, it can be sexy, it can be arousing, uncomfortable even, if that's what you're going for. And my observation is that Bunin had one mode going into all of these stories. It's almost clinical, really. His characters are consumed by this passion. They describe the women's assets in very unfortunate detail, and then they take them. The woman opens her legs, and then it fades to black, because Bunin does not go into full details here. There is no beauty, no excitement, no joy to these desires and sexual acts. There is frustration, burning want, and almost mechanical resolution to it. His characters often hate the objects of their desires, tell them to stay quiet, threaten them with bodily harm, or take them by force. And even when it's consensual, it's not pretty. Look at how the sexual act in calling cards ends. Afterwards, he laid her on the bunk like a dead woman. Gritting her teeth, she lay with closed eyes and already with mournful tranquility on her face, pale now and utterly youthful. And that's the consensual story. I'm also going to use this quote later on in the video for a different theme, so put a pin in it. But tied to this description of sex is the unmistakably male viewpoint. In all of these stories but one, the protagonist, the POV character, is a man, and you feel it. We joke about it sometimes in the feminist circles, how men seemingly are incapable of writing women, as if they've never met one. It always makes me think about this tweet, but there is also a series of fragments by Meg Ellison, If Women Wrote Men the Way Men Write Women. Because we're so used to the misogyny like that, that we simply do not notice it anymore, and these reversals actually help us see the ridiculousness and awfulness of it. It is getting better, make no mistake, but for a long while, female characters felt like caricatures, cardboard cutouts, or male fantasies. And I feel a lot of it here, the male gaze of Bunin. The female characters in his stories are either young girls with no agency, at the mercy of the protagonist's desires, or adult women in charge of their sexuality, and that's what makes the protagonist attracted to them. These stories are full of descriptions of women that I do not find flattering at all, but maybe it's just me. Maybe men do view us like that, and that does not make me want to lock myself up in the apartment and never leave. But what is true is that the protagonist's interest lies solely in the physical appearance of the woman. On rare occasion, when they get to ponder what lies beneath all this captivating beauty, they find that either they don't care, or they don't like it, or they fully reject it. But because these women have little beyond these having bosoms of varying sizes, ankles, thighs, and whatever else the protagonist focuses on, these women become not only uninteresting but also interchangeable. There is nothing that differentiates them between themselves beyond the superficial, so they appear as these massive bodies and nothing else. The reason that I'm tempted to blame Bunin here and put the accusation of male gaze on him is that his female characters also view women through the same lens. The women in Heinrich, the wife in Rusia, Sonia in Natalie, they all provide their depictions of other women, and it's no different from the way that Bunin's male characters would do it. One can find the in-story reasons for it, but let's be honest, it's simply female characters providing a voice for Bunin with no thought as to how women would act here, really. It is a problem, a man writing women without understanding them at all. Another weird example comes in Revenge, where a man notices a woman in a hotel, decides to follow her one morning, takes the same train, follows her into the middle of nowhere in the countryside, where she takes all of her clothes off and decides to bathe in a pond, and he watches her from the bushes, until she calls out to him and summons him to her, and they bond. This is the most unrelatable thing I've read about the female experience. Of course, when a man follows you from the hotel room to a deserted pond, of course he would take all of your clothes off. And of course, when you ask him to turn around and he refuses, you do not see it as a red flag. Perfect depiction, 10 out of 10, no notes. Also, look at this wonderful passage from Heinrich. It's both a woman serving a man's desires and he's allowed to everything simply because he's a man, and also you're not like other girls in a span of 2 lines of dialogue. Gotta love it. And another angle of the same problem is that since these women are not real people, they are simply props for the male characters and they're suffering. One of the tags that I used for these stories was male hurt, which in this case means that he's created a problem in his head, he's suffering because of it, and he's blaming the woman for it. A quick example comes in the very first story, Dark Avenues, where a woman he's betrayed tells him about his life. He quickly tells her that his life was worse, actually, because his wife cheated on him and his son turned out to be a disappointment. Or in Galeganskaya, where a man leads a young girl on, manipulates her and uses her, she ends up killing herself, and the story is framed that we need to feel sorry for him. Because these women are no more than props for him to experience the world and his own emotions. And it's also worth noting that the emotions that he feels towards these women is often pity, anger, and arousal at her fear of him. With the adult women that have dubbed women in charge, he's attracted to her independence and control, but most often it's young girls, and it's their inexperience and their fear of him that attracts him to them. Ugh. Now, do we want to talk about the child molesting? Look, I hear the argument that we need to keep the time period and its customs in mind when we talk about art. There is no point of applying the 21st century morals to the fact that Juliet is only 13 years old while Romeo is close to 20. That's not what the story is about, and it was more in vogue then to marry so young, so it's fine. I understand that we need to try and read Dark Avenues as the product of the 19th century literature, even if Bunin wrote it in the 30s and 40s, he's still emulating the style of the 19th century literature. Except, I don't think that the things that he writes about were ever truly okay. There is a story, Zoika and Valeria, where a student is sexually attracted to a 14-year-old. A story, Styopa, where a man rapes, let's face it, a 15-year-old. A story, Tanya, where he rapes a 17-year-old in her sleep. And that one made me almost physically ill both times I've read it. And it's all fine and dandy if you choose this heavy subject for your stories, but then you need to say something about it, I feel like. Bunin as a storyteller does not show his cards, really. He does not provide a moral judgment on his character's actions. It's up to the reader to do that, so it makes sense for him to write these stories the same way, but I've said something similar in my Lolita video, how Nabokov is careless with his story, and thus the readers also read it wrong. Except I know that Nabokov knew what he was doing. He introduced the unreliable narrator style for a reason, so Lolita is written as he intended. Nabokov was simply too arrogant to assume that his book might have unforeseen consequences and different interpretations other than his own. I'm not 100% sure that Bunin knows what territory he's entered. In a commentary to Styopa, he describes the rape of a 15-year-old girl as the scary and blissful event of her half-childish life. The story often positions these girls as if they like these men and they simply need to overcome this initial fear to receive this blissful experience, and how f***ed up is that? How victim-blaming. Framing matters, and it's not ideal to say the least. The girls leave this act crying, and how am I supposed to read it other than abuse? And Bunin dares call them love stories. And then there are also quotes from Bunin like this: "It is a pity that you wrote that in the Dark Avenues there is an excessive perusal of female forms. What a surplus there is! I have given only 1,000th part of how men of all tribes and peoples view women everywhere, all women from the age of 10 to the age of 90. Bunin might not see a problem here, but I do. The women have no agency here. They are at the mercy of this man who is pursuing pleasure even if it's against her will." And that had me audibly swearing while reading these stories, and also crying out in righteous joy while reading the very last story of the series, A Knight's Tale, where a man tries to rape a young girl but has his throat ripped out by her dog. I need a break. Can you actually tell it's a heart? Made out of sequins. Another overarching theme is that love cannot have a happy ending. which is a choice and not necessarily a bad one from the get-go, but I still would have preferred a little bit more variety here. Because the thing is, it's fun to explore these possibilities. How a jealous husband kills his cheating wife, how the lovers are separated, how the father sends his son away and marries his beloved. It's all fiction, it's fine. But at times it also feels like Bunin had this idea set that these stories could not have a happy ending, or even a happy-ish one. Like in the story Natalie, where the lovers go through the hardships of life, are finally reunited in a small way and not afforded the ultimate happiness of a marriage, and still the woman needs to die in the last sentence of the story. Or in the story in Paris, where two Riley souls find solace in one another, and then a man just dies randomly. It reminds me a little bit of media criticisms that I've seen applied to long-running TV shows, how writers are simply incapable of writing happy couples. It's a fairy tale problem, a they lived happily ever after problem. The story always ends with a couple getting together, and their life after rarely gets explored in media as it is perceived as being boring. Conversely, this is why you get 10 seasons of will they, won't they storylines or strong couples breaking up out of nowhere, because it is perceived as being more interesting to the viewer, when in reality it's simply a failure of writers in writing engaging stories for couples without the major outside conflict. But if we come back to Bunin, it seems like it's his own philosophy that happy love cannot last, it's simply impossible. In these stories, it was likely aggravated by his mistress Galina leaving him, but even before that, his favorite saying was, "It is easier to die for a woman than it is to live with one." And with that, we welcome his wife Vera into a club of geniuses' wives who never really truly appreciated them. And so it seems that Bunin comes in with an ending in mind, that it needs to be tragic no matter the cost. In both examples that I've brought up, it's not needed. It kind of ruins the stories for me, actually, especially Natalie, where the ending was not happy even before Bunin decided to kill her off, so it seems excessive, unnecessary, and artificial. The stories that work are those where the atmosphere is melancholic and tragic throughout, like A Cold Autumn, or where Bunin subverts the expectations for the ending, like in Caucasus. In tandem with this theme of tragedy and melancholy, a motif of death emerges, and sometimes where you would not expect it. Like in that example from Calling Cards, Bunin often describes women after sex as dead, which is its own can of worms, but it goes beyond that. Since Bunin wrote these stories in his late years, this motif of ending life is everywhere, but it's also a theme that he explored throughout his life. Especially once he left Russia and left his country behind to die, or at least that's how he viewed it. And so these stories can also be read as a requiem for a country that no longer exists, that only exists in his memory. And Bunin believed that if he only could remember it and put it to paper, then it would still exist, at least in some small way. I've seen a fun reading of Clean Monday where a woman is compared to Russia and how she cannot choose which path to take until she chooses the path of a nun, metaphorically trying to repent for her sins. So Bunin's own tragedy of leaving his life behind is compounded with the tragedy of the country and the world. And on top of that, most of these stories were written during World War II, when likely it felt like the entire world was ending. Bunin himself later inscribed a copy of The Dark Avenues presented to Zinaida Shekhovskaya. The Decameron was written during the plague, Dark Avenues in the years of Hitler and Stalin, when they tried to devour one another. And so this feeling of decay, the end near, the melancholy, the darkness, the sorrow, it all seeps into his stories. And when Bunin actually focuses on it instead of trying to write clumsy erotica, that's when these stories worked for me. The two stories that I genuinely liked, The Late Hour and The Cold Autumn, they neither has these gross depictions of female body parts nor questionable ethics. It's simply a story of love lost and the life that exists in the shadow of it. They are melancholic, sad stories, so if you're in the mood for that, you can check those out. Stylistically, I also found these stories to be inconsistent. Sometimes they're written quite nicely, the story moves along, the depictions and descriptions are provided to a necessary degree, and then there are others full of clunky exposition and descriptions that are completely unnecessary and simply over the top. And sadly, this is Bunin's signature style, these descriptions. A lot of people like it, a lot of people don't. I personally don't. Look at this passage in Dark Avenues and tell me if you like this style. My main problem is not even the multitudes of adjectives, it's simply that they don't seem to flow. They stack one on top of the other like a precarious tower that's gonna fall at any given moment. I'm much more with Chekhov here, who believed that any detail you introduce into the story needs to be significant, otherwise it needs to be removed. It's especially true when you're writing short form. Tolstoy can get away with full paragraphs describing the sky of Austerlitz. He's writing 800 pages, it's fine. But when your story is 5 pages long, do we really need to know what type of boot he was wearing or what the peasants actually looked like? Not really. Those who like Bunin's style tell us that it adds to the flavor of the piece. For me, it really ruins it. Also, stylistically, you will see that Bunin mostly focuses on 3 things: the smell, the color, and the sound of things. That's mostly where his comparisons and adjectives are focused. And because he started as a poet, he tends to focus on the atmosphere of the piece rather than the plot. And thus, his short stories often read as poems written in prose. I've marked quite a few on my read of The Dark Avenues. They describe a scene or a person or an atmosphere, but not any action. Like in the Camargue, a woman enters a train carriage, we are given her description, and then she leaves. And that's it. So if you like stories where you're simply given a mood or a description of something like a poem would, then these stories might be for you. I feel like I've spent the entire video bashing this book, and that's fine, I can do whatever I want. Even if Bunin believed this to be the pinnacle of his writing, I do not necessarily need to agree with him. There are stories in here that can be quite interesting, but for me they were completely overshadowed by these awful stories like Stjopa or Tanya. If this wasn't a collection that was likely intended to be read as a series, I probably could have been a little bit more nice, but nah, I still hate it. If I still haven't dissuaded you from checking these stories out, read Caucasus, A Cold Autumn, and The Raven. I think those are the better ones.